The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, a truly wonderful masterpiece that has been known to be one of the best games Nintendo has ever made. The wonderful environment and beautiful storytelling combined with the fantastic music that is still heard to this day makes Ocarina of Time a true classic and a game that will most likely never come to pass. Due to the immense popularity of this game, however, conspiracies, theories, and rumors have all developed pertaining to the game that have had fans in a chokehold ever since their creation. Similarly to Super Mario 64, which was also released around this time, conspiracies are the main driving force behind this game. However, unlike Mario 64, there is arguably more to the development of Ocarina of Time than meets the eye, making it a true mystery that is difficult for fans of the Zelda franchise to distinguish what was happening behind the scenes. But in this video, we will be diving into one of the most interesting pieces of this game's development with the lost content of Ocarina of Time. And whether you believe it or not, there is more than you may think that lies beneath the surface. So without further ado, let us wind back the clocks back to the days of the development and ultimate release of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time has one of the most interesting development timelines in gaming history, and can be a little complex to follow due to the fact that distinguishing fact from truth is so difficult with the spread of misinformation regarding its upbringing and development. However, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, which was originally known as Zelda 64 in its early days of development, began development in 1994 to be the first Legend of Zelda game to be in full 3D. This Zelda 64 game was being developed to be put onto a Nintendo 64 add-on known as the Nintendo 64 Disk Drive, which was initially supposed to be the concrete release for this new addition to the system itself. However, the problem with this is that the release of this new console edition was a constant nightmare for Nintendo, as it was constantly being delayed for release to the public, despite the fact that it would technically be an improvement to the base Nintendo 64 console that would allow for improved gameplay with more content for a wide variety of some games. Due to the poor publicity of this console and the fact that it kept getting thrown to further and further release dates, series creator Shigeru Miyamoto ultimately decided that the Zelda 64 should be released as a simple cartridge just as any other Nintendo 64 game had been at the time. This unfortunately meant that all of the planned features that Ocarina of Time was supposed to have could not be fully implemented due to the shortage differences, meaning that all of the game's content could only fit onto one 32 megabyte cartridge, which actually was the largest cartridge storage of any Nintendo product released up until that moment. Despite this, Shigeru Miyamoto had stated that upon the release of the Nintendo 64 Disk Drive, a add-on to the game would be created that would implement all of the features that the original development of Zelda 64 was missing out on, which he coined Ura Zelda, or Ocarina of Time Ura in Japan. Essentially, the content that was left over from the development of Zelda 64 got split into two versions that were both being developed as separate games. Ura Zelda, which translated to Other Zelda, was advertised by Miyamoto as being a equivalent to essentially DLC today, with extra content being added that was not featured in the base game due to limitations with the cartridge, including the addition of new dungeons, NPCs, and items that would have altered the world of Ocarina of Time as we know it today. Ura Zelda, in theory, would have fixed the problems with the admittedly rocky and unstable development of Zelda 64, and would allow the fans to ultimately be pleased with the final result once the N64 DD would finally release. On the other side of the coin, Zelda Gaiden, which translated to Zelda Side Story, was another addition that was planned to be added to the N64, but the development behind the add-on began to become a lot more than what was initially expected. Zelda Gaiden would continue development during its time on the N64, and would patiently await the release of the N64 DD just as the previous expansion Ura Zelda was as well. However, Zelda 64, which was renamed to The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time prior to the release of the game, would eventually be released to the public on November 21st, 1998, and would become one of the key staples of the Nintendo 64. Ocarina of Time was a game that was filled with an enormous amount of content, and was a fantastic piece of technology that was released to the N64 with large areas, dungeons, temples, and a multitude multitude of NPCs around the in-game world that would allow the player to be immersed in the experience. And that is why many were surprised to hear that an add-on to the game was being planned by Miyamoto with the upcoming release of Zelda, which he had stated in an interview that he wanted it to be released shortly after the release of Ocarina of Time in 1998, which unfortunately would not be possible due to the fact that the N64 DD got pushed back once more, not seeing an official release until the December of 1999, leading it to become one of the worst selling consoles of all time. It would only sell approximately 15,000 units. And we thought the Wii U was bad. Despite this failure, according to Miyamoto, Zelda was still in development, but the other addition to Ocarina of Time, Zelda Gaiden, was branching off significantly to its Zelda counterpart. The designer behind the majority of the dungeons within this game, A.G. Aonuma, felt that this edition was becoming an entire game that was too similar to the Zelda 64 game just released, eventually leading him to ask for permission to make an entirely separate game as a whole. This was accepted by Miyamoto, under the challenge that Aonuma could create the game in only 1 year, in which Aonuma accepted. This Zelda Gaiden edition would eventually expand to what we now know as The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, which would be released on April 27, 2007, with debatably the same, if not even more popularity than its Ocarina of Time counterpart. Around this time, it was stated by Miyamoto that Zelda, the other counterpart, was fully developed for some time now and was just awaiting a release. However, due to the N64 falling behind in the technical field, Nintendo had to move on from the console to develop a new one, which of course we now know as the Nintendo GameCube, which was released in the September of 2001. Something unexpected occurred in this development, however, as leading up to the release of the new Zelda game for the GameCube, known as The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, Nintendo would build up excitement due to a new version of Ocarina of Time being bundled with the pre-order release of this game, being named Master Quest. Many thought that this was it, the final release of the Zelda with new dungeons, new items, and completely refurbished areas that would be one of the best games in the sphere at the time, which would lead to Wind Waker being the most pre-ordered game of the year, which was an insane statistic. However, upon receiving this supposed new version of Ocarina of Time, people began to realize that this supposed new version of Ocarina of Time really only switched up the dungeons a little bit by changing the layout, and making some items that were once not needed a priority. Safe to say, many were disappointed with this turnout, especially since Zelda was supposedly much more than what was released in the vanilla game, and the evidence does suggest that they removed the larger aspirations for this game just to release a Zelda game to build excitement and pre-orders for their new game. However, now that you have a basic grasp and understanding of the rocky development of Ocarina of Time and how it shifted over time to new aspirations, let us dive into the lost content associated with this game that was never brought to life by the Zelda project. The underwhelming release of Master Quest was a punch in the gut for some people, as those who had been wanting to see a fully completed Ocarina of Time game with all of the rumored additions were completely left in the dust and ultimately dissatisfied because of it. However, the game that we actually received was not all there was to the game itself. Due to the notorious 2020 GigaLeak that brought light to a multitude of Nintendo games, including Ocarina of Time, and the pre-release trailers and gameplay footage, we can finally see the intentions behind some of the developers to see what was really left behind for the release of the game itself. The first and major feature that was spotted within these leaks was a completely scrapped dungeon that never saw the light of day, which was what many were thinking the original Zelda would be, especially with adding new dungeons. Essentially, this cut dungeon that was originally meant to be within the game was found in the files and roughly constructed based off of beta images by a YouTuber known as Zell, in which we see a unique dungeon that is shrouded in mystery. Upon entrance, we see two pathways with two doors that both lead to identical hallways that have a extremely odd torch holder in them, with what looks to be a face with a tongue sticking out. It is a extremely odd addition to the dungeon, especially since we don't see it anywhere else in any part of the game, and it furthers its mystery as to what was going to be within this dungeon as a whole. Moving on, there is a room with a L is Real statue from the Mario 64 game, which actually features featured in the base game of Ocarina of Time, but its placement is simply odd, as it sits at the center of the room with no real purpose. Who knows what importance it has in the grand scheme of the dungeon itself, and its addition is odd to say the least, which is exemplified by more of these torch designs that now feature eyes instead of just a tongue and face. What is extremely notable about this dungeon in particular is that it heavily resembles Ganon's castle near the end of Ocarina of Time, meaning full and well that this could have been a scrap dungeon that was used for the final release of the game. The odd thing about this dungeon additionally is the fact that it opens up into a skybox with a staircase that leads up to the top of the tower itself, which is such a strange addition. All in all, I personally believe that this scrap dungeon was originally going to be a dungeon within the game, but was ultimately scrapped to use its assets on the Ganon Tower, as the design and features of it heavily resemble that of the tower we see in the final release. Another scrap project that would have been implemented onto Ocarina of Time was a multitude of scrap temples that have been theorized to exist. One of the main temples that is heavily theorized to be within the development of this game is the notorious Light Temple, which would have given Link the Light Medallion rather than Rauru himself just giving it to him. Evidence within the files of the game suggests that the Light Temple was supposed to be a playable temple, rather than just simply entering the Chamber of Sages as Link does in the game, including the presence of these keys in the files with one representing each temple. Combined with the fact that it was clear that there was supposed to be some sort of way to earn the Light Medallion, the Light Temple clearly was meant to be a addition within the game that was ultimately never added due to the constraints of storage. The key piece of the Light Temple, however, is that it most likely was where Link would originally be able to gain the Triforce, which can actually be seen in these screenshots for the Ocarina of Time game before it released. As you can see, Link is in a room that looks very similar to the color palette of the Chamber of Sages, meaning that it is likely Link would have achieved the Triforce here and been able to equip it in some form, which can be seen with the fact the pause menu strangely has the pieces of the Triforce absent. Additionally, another temple that was meant to be added was an Ice Temple, which is said to replace the Water Temple within the game, and a Wind Temple that would have replaced the Forest Temple. The Ice Temple was actually in development during the time of the 64DD, however had most likely had to be cut due to the size of the cartridge, and some of its assets would ultimately be pushed to Ice Cavern, which is a playable area of Ocarina of Time. The Ice Temple was additionally represented in Ganon's castle, which seems to have remnants of what was created for this temple. The Wind Temple was most likely supposed to replace the Forest Temple due to the fact that the room that represents the Forest Temple in Ganon's castle has fans in it, and how the medallion itself has a fan or windmill on it instead of some sort of forestry. Speaking of medallions, the game would have actually been planned to have equipable medallions, which most likely would have given the player certain abilities that represent the medallion itself. For instance, it has been theorized that the Fire Medallion could have replaced Din's Fire in the pre-release of the game, and the other medallions could have had similar effects relating to their elemental counterpart. I could go on and on about the endless cut content that could have been featured for this game. It seemingly never ends, and the amount of new additions that could have been implemented into this game is astounding. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, despite having its missing pieces due to a lack of technological excellence, is one of the best games in terms of storytelling and composition that I have personally ever encountered. And it truly baffles me that Nintendo has not re-released a remaster of this game since its HD version on the 3DS. Seeing Zelda with the graphical capabilities of the newer Nintendo consoles would be amazing, and certainly the remastered music would be an absolute joy to listen to, and I really hope that one day we can experience the content once again. And who knows, maybe Nintendo can make what they were supposed to make 27 years ago. Maybe one day Miyamoto will fully reveal what the Ocarina of Time game would have truly contained, but maybe it will remain a complete mystery. But that is all. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. If you have anything to say that could potentially improve my work, I am always open to suggestions. But until next time, peace.